Hi everyone, it's Miss Willis here. I'm here to talk to you about forests and agroforestry, and specifically what are the types of forests and how are fires involved in forestry and forest management. So let's get started. First off, we should probably talk about all the different types of forests that exist. The really old forests are obviously called the old growth forests, and these are ones that have been around for hundreds of years and really haven't been touched by humans, so they haven't been cut down at all. On average, they're pretty much older than 200 years. Compare that to second growth forests. These are forests that have been cut down but have regenerated. So they are often younger than old growth forests, and they have really regenerated due to secondary ecological succession. And then, of course, we have our tree plantations. So a tree plantation is, the way I think about it, is pretty much a farm for trees. So trees are needed for things like, I don't know, Christmas. They're needed for things like lumber, materials. And so oftentimes what businesses will do is they'll just grow a whole bunch of the same type of tree. So in essence, a monoculture, but it's trees. So we call it a tree farm or a tree plantation. All right, so when the U.S. Forest Service goes in and they manage our national forests, there's different ways that they can manage the trees. The first way you can manage trees is through even age management. So that means pretty much when you look at the forest, all the trees are pretty much the same age and they're harvested at around the same time. So that means when they regrow, they'll pretty much be the same age again. Compare that to uneven age management, where you go in and you pretty much selectively choose what trees to remove, and of course you replant. But if you look in the forest, there's a whole bunch of different trees and they're of the different age. You can usually tell just by their heights. So oftentimes as humans, we do need trees. We need them for things like building materials. So we need to go into forests and remove the trees for those materials. And yes, there are some environmental impacts for that, but it is needed. So there's different ways that you can harvest or take the trees from an area. The first one being what's called selective cutting, and we mentioned it on the previous slide. So in selective cutting, you go into the forest and you usually take the bigger, more mature trees to harvest and use. There are some good things associated with that. The first thing being that it does reduce crowding in the forest, so you allow the younger trees to actually have a chance. So they have access to sunlight and nutrients, whereas when you had the bigger, older trees, they were kind of blocking that sunlight for the younger trees. It does allow for natural regeneration of the trees to occur, and because you're leaving some of the trees behind, you're keeping the soil in place, thus reducing soil erosion. Another way that you can harvest trees is through clear cutting. And clear cutting is the process of pretty much just removing all the trees from an area. So you can see here in this picture, this is obviously an area that has been clear cut. The people came in and pretty much just tore out all the trees. Now, I want you to think there are some good and bad things, of course, associated with clear cutting, but if you were a timber company, why would you want to remove all the trees at once? So think about why that might be beneficial for you. And then if you're an environmentalist, you might be thinking, clear cutting is not so great. Why would that be harmful to the environment? So just take a second and think about it. So timber company, why is it good? Environmentally, why might it be harmful? Well, if you're a timber company and you clear cut, you definitely get a big timber yield all at once. So you get a lot of lumber that you can sell off and increase your profits. It does shorten the time needed for a new strand of trees because you can come in and just plant and then they'll regrow. It does provide the maximum economic return because you're getting all of the trees all at once. And it does take less skill, meaning you don't have to train people to selectively cut which trees and why. If you are a clear cutter, you pretty much just come in and bulldoze all of them down. So it doesn't take a lot of skill in that. But clear cutting does obviously have some very negative environmental impacts. It does leave large forest openings, so it does decrease habitat. People really don't like hiking or any recreational value of a forest once it's been clear cut. It does reduce biodiversity because species do need to go find other places to live. It does lead to soil erosion because you are not leaving any of those roots in place. You cut them all down, thus the soil can easily move when it rains or if there's wind. And the nearby trees that are left, they do become more susceptible to wind erosion or wind problems because the wind is hitting them and it obviously can knock them down. So there are some good things and bad things to clear cutting, just like everything in an AP environmental science course that you probably learned about. But yeah, so that's why people clear cut. Now, in order to get to the trees, to harvest them, you have to construct what are called logging roads. And oftentimes they are just dirt roads that allow the logging trucks to get into the area where they can cut down the trees. There are some environmental problems associated with logging roads. Number one, it does increase soil erosion because you are cutting and removing areas of land and you're leaving behind just the dirt. So it makes it very susceptible to move. You do get some habitat fragmentation and habitat loss. I know this seems weird, but some species really don't like crossing roads. And so these populations then get separated when you put a road in place. If you have a road that cuts through the forest, now transportation can happen, but also you can have the transport of things like pests or non-native species because you've just provided access into areas of the forest that maybe they didn't have before. And lastly, these trucks, they're quite large because they are covering, lots of ground and they have to carry lots of trees. There is air pollution associated with the truck. So let me go ahead and show you a picture. So you can see this is what a logging truck may look like, not always, but they are heavy duty. They do require a lot of diesel fuel or gasoline fuel to operate, and so they do produce pollution. An example of a pest that has caused problems in the trees on the East Coast is something called the Asian longhorn beetle. So this beetle caught a ride, I believe it was on a boat, and it wound up in New York. It was discovered in a warehouse in Brooklyn, and what this beetle does is it actually drills holes into the tree, and then it sucks out the nutrients from, the phloem of the tree. So essentially what it does is it robs the tree of nutrients, and then over time the tree does die. So what forest management people in the East Coast have been doing is, I know it's going to seem weird, but they do vaccinate or use pesticides to remove the pests from the trees. All right, so that leads us to fires. So parts of, obviously, forestry management are going to involve fires. And there's different types of fires, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of fires. So first off, we have our surface fires. And surface fires, I would think, are pretty much the most common fires, specifically around here in Los Angeles. They tend to burn the undergrowth of the trees. So if you're in a forest, they tend to stay low on the surface. They are beneficial, and this is kind of a different way of thinking because in the past, scientists and things thought fires were no good, so immediately they were suppressed. But we are realizing that fires can actually be beneficial to environments. So fires, they can release nutrients from the leaf litter and put it back into the soil. Some species here in the chaparral biome, for example, they need that fire to stimulate germination. So if they don't get that fire cue, the seeds don't sprout. And then lastly, fire can control things that have invaded, so maybe invasive species or pathogens that are in the area. Fires can tend to wipe them out. So surface fires can be extremely beneficial. Here's another picture of a surface fire, typical surface fire in the LA area. All right, a crown fire is a fire that burns primarily at the crown of the tree. They tend to be very hot and fast-moving fires, and the reason why they're called crown fires is they tend to jump from crown to crown on the tree. Sometimes they do occur due to leaf litter buildup. So when you have a lot of trees and the leaves die and fall, they tend to build up on the ground. If there's nothing coming along that's decomposing them quickly, they tend to build up. And so it makes them very flammable because they're dead leaves, and they can cause some pretty significant big fires. It does destroy a lot of vegetation, it does kill wildlife, and obviously leads to soil erosion because the trees do die. The third type of fire is called a ground fire, and these tend to happen underneath the ground because there is dead organic material that's underneath the ground. What's weird is sometimes you don't even know it's happening. There can be flames, but sometimes there are no flames, and the fire kind of just smolders underneath the ground for a long period of time. So back in the day, the idea was to prevent and suppress fires. But again, like I was saying, ecologically, we have learned that fires are very beneficial to some environments. So the first thing that the U.S. Forest Service did was to practice and preach about prevention. So this is where you see the Smokey the Bear public service announcements come out. Pretty much only you can protect a forest fire. So you really need to take steps in order to prevent these huge fires. The second step that the U.S. Forest Service has now embraced is something called prescribed fires. And so that's where they go into a forest and intentionally set it on fire. And they do this, again, because of all the reasons we just listed about how they're ecologically beneficial. The third thing is pre-suppression. So this is when a fire does happen, the fire management service will go in and start trying to control the fire, controlling where it moves, maybe doing breaks around the fire to kind of keep the fire in one place. And then the last step is suppression. So this is where ultimately you do anything that's possible to stop the spread of the fire. So those are the 4 basic steps of a fire timeline. Now, the U.S. Forest Service, they have a let it burn policy in place. So if a fire does start in a national park or forest, the idea is to let it burn because it is ecologically important. However, they will step in if homes or buildings are in danger. So they do suppress the fire when it becomes a concern for people around the area. So that leads us to, well, how can we use fewer trees, right? You learned all about forests and fires. Are there steps that we can take to minimize our lumber usage, our timber usage? So there's a couple of ideas out here. Obviously, I'm sure you could think of some. So use construction materials wisely, maybe reuse wood pieces in your building materials, lay off excessive packaging. I'm sure you've been to the store and you've seen all the things that are made out of paper products that come from trees. You can stop your junk mail. A lot of times, for example, like greendimes.org, I know is a company that does this, but a lot of times you can just write the companies that are sending the excessive mailers in the mail, and you can tell them, hey, take my name off the list, and they'll do it. So that will save paper products. Of course, recycle paper, and I hope your school has a recycling program in place for paper. There's also other things that you can use instead of lumber for paper products or things like that. There's kenaf and hemp that can be used instead of trees for building and also paper. And what's great about these is these fibers, they tend to use less herbicides. They're fast growing. They also use less insecticides because apparently they're too fibrous for pests. And they use less fertilizer because some of the species are nitrogen fixers. So you don't have to put nitrogen into the ground because they already can harness it for themselves. And then lastly, what happens in tropical forests specifically, so areas in tropical rainforest, you do see a lot of slash and burn, and you do see a lot of logging. So we've talked about slash and burn previously in some other lectures, but I'll just review here. That's where you go into the forest, you cut it down, and then you set it on fire. And the reason why you do that is because it returns all the nutrients back into the ground. And then what will happen is people will come along and maybe they'll plant agricultural products there, and they'll use the nutrients that came from the trees. Okay, so it's really important that you protect areas of tropical forest, because once you do that, the lifespan of that land is something like 2 to 3 years. It loses all its nutrients very quickly, and then once you're done growing, you can't grow anything else. The trees are gone, the agriculture's gone, so it becomes pretty much a barren wasteland. You should educate people about this process. Slowing population size and growth would obviously always help our forest resources. And of course, take active steps to reforest and rehabilitate areas that have been deforested. Okay, well, I hope this was very informative. I hope you know all about trees and forests and fires. And I look forward to seeing you guys at the next lecture. Thank you.